What would you do if the man who shattered your heart, the man who called you an anchor, holding him back, decided to get married on the one day of the year that was sacred to you both? For Aurora Monroe, that day was October 12th, her wedding anniversary. The invitation wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration of war on her memory. But Declan Peterson made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed his ex-wife was still the broken woman he'd left behind. He had no idea she was about to RSVP in a way that would not only crash his wedding, but shatter his entire carefully constructed new world. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, nestled between a catalogue for Italian leather goods and a bill from the architectural firm. It was thick, creamy cardstock, the kind that whispers of expense and occasion. Aurora Monroe ran a manicured finger over the embossed lettering, her heart giving a painful, familiar lurch. Mr. and Mrs. Gerald Miller request the pleasure of your company at the marriage of their daughter Sophie Miller to Mr. Declan Peterson. And there at the bottom, the date that felt like a deliberate poisoned dart, Saturday the 12th of October. Their anniversary. 5 years they had been married. 10 years they had been together. October 12th wasn't just a date. It was a cornerstone of her life, a day she had once believed was etched into the stars. Even after the divorce, a messy, brutal affair that had flayed her soul raw, the date remained sacrosanct. She'd spend it quietly, sometimes with her sister, sometimes alone, a day of somber reflection on the woman she used to be. Now Declan was taking that too. He wasn't just moving on. He was bulldozing the ruins of their shared history to build his new life on top of them. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, sounding foreign in the minimalist quiet of her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. Of course he was. It was so quintessentially Declan, grandiose, selfish, and utterly thoughtless. The divorce had been 2 years ago. The words he'd used still echoed in her mind during her weaker moments. You're not ambitious enough, Aurora. You're comfortable. You're an anchor, and I'm a ship meant for the open sea. He had made her feel small, as if her dreams of building her interior design firm brick by painstaking brick were quaint hobbies compared to his vague, bombastic ambitions in the world of finance. He'd painted her as the reason his career hadn't skyrocketed, the quiet domestic weight holding back his ascent. The irony was so thick she could choke on it. In the 2 years since he'd cut the anchor, her firm, Monroe Interiors, had exploded. She'd landed a feature in Architectural Digest, secured contracts with 2 boutique hotel chains, and was now in negotiations to design a series of luxury lofts in Dubai. She wasn't just successful. She was thriving in a way she never could have when a part of her energy was constantly being diverted to soothe his fragile ego. She dropped the invitation on the marble island, the sharp clack echoing in the room. Her phone buzzed. It was a picture message from Maxwell. He was standing on a tarmac in Geneva, a breathtaking backdrop of the Swiss Alps behind him, grinning into the camera. The text read, "Closed the deal. The prototype is officially ours. Celebrating with fondue. Wish you were here. Home tomorrow. J." A genuine smile touched Aurora's lips, the first one since opening the mail. Maxwell Lancaster, the man who had walked into her life 6 months ago like a calm, steady sunrise after a long, violent storm. He was a tech billionaire, a fact he rarely mentioned. And that was the least interesting thing about him. He was kind, fiercely intelligent, and looked at her not as an anchor, but as the sea itself, vast, powerful, and beautiful. He celebrated her successes with more enthusiasm than she did listening for hours as she detailed fabric swatches and lighting schematics. With him, she felt seen, not just observed. She picked up the invitation again, the anger returning, but this time it was different. It wasn't the hollow ache of a victim. It was a cold, clarifying fire. Declan didn't know who she was anymore. He still saw her as the woman who cried for a week after he left, the woman who had to sell their shared brownstone because she couldn't bear the memories. He was flaunting his new life, his new bride, Sophie Miller, a socialite whose father owned half of Wall Street. Aurora noted with a cynical pang on their day, assuming she would shrink wounded into the shadows. He was assuming she was still anchored in their past. That night she couldn't sleep. She paced the length of her apartment, the glittering panorama of New York City, a silent witness to her turmoil. The city had been their playground. They'd had their first date at a small jazz club in the village. He'd proposed on the Bow Bridge in Central Park on a crisp autumn afternoon, just like this one. His ghost was everywhere. For 2 years, she had worked to exorcise him. She'd poured her pain, her anger, her resilience into her work, and it had paid off. She had built a fortress around her heart with steel and glass and success. But this invitation was a battering ram threatening to breach the walls. Going was out of the question. It was masochistic. It was handing Declan the victory, showing up alone, a spectre at his feast. It would confirm every condescending, pitying glance from his family and friends who had always thought he was too good for her. Not going felt like defeat. It felt like hiding. It felt like letting him have the final say on what October 12th meant. It would be his wedding day forever. The thought was unbearable. She found herself in her home office, scrolling through the social media profile of Sophie Miller. It was a curated gallery of perfection. Skiing in Aspen, yachting in Monaco, charity galas at the Met. Sophie was blonde, beautiful, and radiated the effortless confidence of someone who had never wanted for anything. In one photo, Declan stood beside her, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. He wore a tailored suit, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He looked like he'd won. Aurora's finger hovered over a picture of the engaged couple, a professionally shot photo with Sophie's enormous diamond ring prominently displayed. The caption penned by Sophie read, "I can't wait to marry my king and build our empire together. Declan Peterson, you are my everything." His empire, Aurora thought, with a humorless smile. Declan had always talked about his empire, a vague and glorious future that was always just around the corner, always impeded by some external factor, the market, his boss, his supposedly unsupportive wife. The fire within her burned hotter. It wasn't about the man anymore. She felt nothing for Declan but a dull, clinical revulsion. It was about the narrative. He had written the story of their ending, casting her as the villain, the dead weight. He was now writing a new story, a triumphant sequel on the very day that defined their shared history. She would not allow it. She would not be a footnote in the story of Declan Peterson. When Maxwell's car pulled up to her building the next evening, she was waiting. He stepped out, a tall, commanding presence, in a simple grey sweater and jeans that probably cost more than her first car. He enveloped her in a hug, his scent a comforting mix of expensive cologne and the clean, crisp air of the Alps still clinging to his coat. "You seem tense," he said, his perceptive blue eyes searching hers. "Everything okay?" Inside, she handed him the invitation. He read it, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly. He looked from the cardstock to the date, then back to her face. He saw the storm in her eyes. "The 12th," he said, his voice low, "of all the days in the year." "It's a power move," Aurora said, her voice tight. "It's a final twist of the knife to make sure I know he won." "And what do you want to do about it?" Maxwell asked. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her to ignore it or that Declan wasn't worth her energy. He knew she was past that. This was something different. "I was going to throw it away. I was going to book a spa day, fly to Paris, anything to pretend it isn't happening," she admitted. "But it feels like letting him win. It feels like I'm still letting him dictate my life, even in his absence." She looked at Maxwell, at his calm, unwavering face. "He thinks I'm still the person he left. He thinks I'm alone, struggling, a comfortable little designer. He has no idea who I am now." A slow smile spread across Maxwell's face. It was the smile he got when he was about to solve a complex coding problem or outmaneuver a corporate rival. "So," he said, his eyes glinting with a shared spark of rebellion, "why don't we show him?" The idea, once spoken aloud, took on a life of its own. It shifted from a wild, vengeful fantasy into a tangible, strategic plan. Maxwell's question, "Why don't we show him?" wasn't just rhetorical. It was an offer, a key to a door Aurora hadn't even realized was there. "What do you mean, show him?" she asked, a tremor of excitement running through her. "Crash his wedding, Maxwell. That's insane. It's dramatic and petty." "Is it?" he countered, leaning against the kitchen island, the picture of calm audacity. "Or is it simply correcting a narrative? He's telling a story about you to his new family, to his friends, to himself. A story where you were the weak link. You have the opportunity to present a revised edition." He picked up the invitation again. "Blackwood Manor. Quaint, old money aesthetic. An hour north of the city. We could drive." He paused, a theatrical glint in his eye. "Or we could make an entrance that's a little less terrestrial." Aurora's heart started beating faster. She knew what he was suggesting. Maxwell owned a fleet of private aircraft through a subsidiary of his company, Lancaster Aerospace. To him, a jet was like a car. "You want to fly to his wedding?" she breathed. "The manor has a heliport, but it's small, barely fit for a Bell 429, Maxwell mused, already scrolling on his phone. "However, there's a private airfield less than 10 miles away. Ample runway for the G700. We could be there, wheels down, in under 20 minutes from Teterboro." The Gulfstream G700, Maxwell's newest acquisition, a flying masterpiece of engineering and luxury that he often called his sky office. The thought was so audacious, so utterly beyond the realm of anything Declan could possibly conceive of, that Aurora laughed, a real deep laugh that broke the tension in her chest. He would have a complete and total meltdown, she said, the image flashing in her mind. "That's a potential side effect," Maxwell said, with a straight face. "But that's not the point. The point, Aurora, is for you to walk into that place, not as Declan Peterson's sad ex-wife, but as Aurora Monroe, the woman you are today. Successful, happy, and with a man who sees you as a supernova, not an anchor. It's not about revenge. It's about closure, on your terms." His words sliced through her remaining hesitation. He was right. This wasn't about being petty. It was about reclaiming her own story. It was about showing up for herself, proving to the one person who mattered her that the ghosts of the past had no power. "Okay," she said, the word feeling momentous. "Let's do it." The next 10 days were a whirlwind of focused preparation. It felt less like planning a party crash and more like a military operation, with Maxwell as the general and Aurora as the commander on the ground. First, the dress. Aurora knew it couldn't be just any dress. It had to be a statement. She didn't want a revenge dress in the classic sense, not something overtly sexy or attention-seeking. She needed something that spoke of power, elegance, and untouchable grace. She called in a favor with a designer friend in Milan, a woman whose couture gowns were usually reserved for red carpets and royalty. She explained the situation vaguely at first. "I have an event. I need to make an impression." What kind of impression, the designer Isabella had asked over a video call? "Like I own the world, but I'm too busy to be bothered with the paperwork," Aurora replied. Isabella had cackled with delight. "Say no more, my darling. I have the perfect creation." 3 days later, a custom-fitted gown arrived by courier. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that seemed to drink the light. It was cut with architectural precision, a high neckline, long sleeves, and a column silhouette that draped over her body like liquid moonlight. The only embellishment was a cascade of tiny diamond-like crystals scattered across one shoulder, as if she had brushed against a nebula. It was breathtaking. It was perfect. Next, Maxwell handled the logistics. He arranged for the jet, the pilots, and a gleaming black Rolls-Royce Phantom to be waiting at the private airfield near Blackwood Manor. "Subtlety in motion," he called it. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Aurora asked him one evening as they sat on her balcony sharing a bottle of wine. A sliver of doubt had crept in. "It's your time, your resources. It's my baggage." Maxwell took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Let me tell you something about my world, Aurora. It's filled with people who want something from me. My money, my connections, my name. It's a constant transaction. With you, it's different. You want my time. You want my heart. You let me into your world, your baggage included. Helping you close this chapter isn't a chore. It's a privilege. Besides," he added with a wink, "I've always wanted to see a narcissist's face when his carefully constructed reality implodes. I'll bring popcorn." His unwavering support was her armor. With him by her side, she felt invincible. The day before the wedding, a package arrived for her. It was a small, velvet box from Maxwell. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a necklace. It was a single, impossibly large, pear-cut sapphire suspended from a delicate platinum chain. It was the exact shade of her dress. Her breath caught. It was a museum-quality piece. "Maxwell, this is too much." He called her the moment he knew she'd received it. "It's not too much," he said, his voice warm. "It's a reminder. That man gave you costume jewelry and empty promises. I just wanted you to wear a piece of the sky." On the morning of October the 12th, Aurora woke up, not with the familiar dread, but with a strange electric calm. There was no sadness, no painful nostalgia. It was just a date, a day for a new memory to be forged. She spent the morning at her office, signing off on the Dubai project drafts. Her focus was sharp, her mind clear. She was Aurora Monroe, CEO of a thriving company. Declan Peterson was a footnote from a previous chapter. By late afternoon, the transformation began. A hair and makeup artist recommended by Isabella worked silently and efficiently. Her hair was swept up into a sleek, intricate chignon. Her makeup was understated but striking, emphasizing her eyes, making them look like polished obsidian. When she finally slipped into the midnight blue gown, she hardly recognized the woman in the mirror. This was not the girl who had married Declan Peterson. This was not the woman who had crumbled when he left. This was someone else entirely. Someone forged in fire. Maxwell arrived looking impossibly handsome in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes sweeping over her. Aurora, he breathed, his voice filled with genuine awe. You are transcendent. He held out his hand, and as she took it, he fastened the sapphire necklace around her neck. The cool weight of it against her skin was a final click of a lock, sealing her resolve. Ready to go? He asked. She took a deep breath, meeting his gaze in the mirror. Ready. The flight to Teterboro was silent and swift. As they boarded the Gulf Stream, the sheer scale of the moment hit her. The cabin was larger than her first apartment, all cream leather and polished mahogany. The flight attendant offered them champagne. As the jet engines spooled up with a powerful rising whine, Aurora looked out the window at the setting sun, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. She thought of Declan down on the ground, probably adjusting his tie, basking in the adoration of his guests, completely oblivious. He thought he was the ship meant for the open sea. He had no idea a hurricane was coming. Blackwood Manor was exactly as Aurora had pictured it, a sprawling Tudor-style estate that tried very hard to project an air of old-world aristocracy. Manicured lawns, ivy-covered stone walls, and a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees. As the Rolls-Royce Phantom glided silently up the drive, Aurora could see the main house ablaze with light, the cheerful sounds of a string quartet drifting through the crisp autumn air. Guests in their finest attire mingled on the flagstone patio, champagne flutes in hand. It was a scene of carefully curated elegance, tasteful, expensive, and utterly predictable. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 5:30 p.m. Just as the sun began to set. Maxwell had timed their arrival for 6:15 p.m., perfectly positioned to intercept the post-ceremony, pre-reception cocktail hour. It was the moment of maximum social visibility. Their approach, however, had begun 10 minutes earlier. The first sign that something was amiss in the world of Blackwood Manor was a sound. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more than heard. It wasn't the familiar thwump-thwump of a helicopter, but a deeper, more powerful roar that seemed to come from the sky itself. The string quartet faltered mid-Mozart. Guests paused their conversations, tilting their heads, their brows furrowed in confusion. The sound grew swelling from a hum to a full-throated roar that rattled the antique window panes and vibrated through the soles of their expensive shoes. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated power. Heads turned, eyes scanning the darkening sky. And then they saw it. Banking gracefully over the Hudson River Valley, its landing lights cutting through the twilight, was the sleek, unmistakable shape of a Gulfstream G700. It was impossibly large, impossibly close. It flew with a majestic, predatory grace, its silver fuselage catching the last rays of the setting sun. It was so out of context for this quiet, bucolic setting that it felt like a scene from a movie. The jet didn't land at the manor, of course. It continued its elegant descent towards the private airfield a few miles away, its thunderous passage a herald of something to come. The whispers started immediately. What on earth was that? Did you see the size of it? Whose jet is that? Does someone here know the president? Inside the main hall, Declan Peterson was at the peak of his glory. He had just exchanged vows with Sophie Miller. He was now officially connected to one of New York's wealthiest families. His financial troubles were a thing of the past. He stood with his new wife, his hand possessively on the small of her back, accepting congratulations. His mother, Margaret Peterson, a woman with a perpetually pinched face and disapproving eyes, hovered nearby, beaming with pride for the first time in years. Such a wonderful ceremony, Declan, a guest, gushed, and Sophie, You look radiant." Declan's smile was wide and practiced. "Thank you. We're just so thrilled to start our life together. It's a new beginning, a real ascent." He loved that word, ascent. It was then that the low growl of a high-performance engine replaced the fading roar of the jet. The Rolls-Royce Phantom, black as a starless night, pulled to a stop at the manor's grand entrance. It was a vehicle that commanded attention, not through noise, but through its sheer imposing presence. A valet, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and panic, scrambled to open the passenger door. The first thing the guests on the patio saw was a leg, long, elegant, clad in a sheer stocking, and ending in a stiletto that looked like it was carved from obsidian. Then Aurora Monroe emerged. A collective, hushed intake of breath seemed to suck the air from the patio. She rose from the car, not like a person, but like an event. The midnight blue gown flowed around her, the crystals on her shoulder glittering like a captured constellation. The sapphire at her throat was a point of deep, cold fire. Her hair was a sculpted masterpiece, her face serene and unreadable. She didn't look angry or vengeful. She looked like she was bored with gods. She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the stunned crowd with a look of cool, mild appraisal. Then Maxwell stepped out from the other side. If Aurora was the queen of the night, he was her king. The Tom Ford tuxedo fit him like a second skin. He radiated an aura of quiet, unassailable confidence. He wasn't handsome in the flashy, desperate way Declan was. He was handsome in the way a mountain is handsome, solid, timeless, and powerful. He walked to Aurora's side and offered her his arm, his movements economical and precise. Together, they looked less like wedding guests and more like they had arrived to purchase the entire estate as a weekend getaway. The whispers on the patio turned into frantic, urgent murmurs. "Is that Aurora, Declan's ex-wife? My God, I didn't even recognize her. Who is that with her? He looks important. That dress, that necklace must have cost more than the wedding." Declan had just raised a glass of champagne to his lips when he saw the commotion at the door. He turned, a slight annoyance on his face, expecting a late-arriving cousin. His eyes fell on the couple framed in the grand entryway. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud in the sudden silence. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, pale mask. His jaw went slack. It was a total system failure. His mind simply could not process the data it was receiving. Aurora, that was Aurora, the comfortable, mousy anchor of a woman he had so righteously discarded. And who the hell was the man with her who looked like he could buy and sell everyone in the room? Before his first drink was finished, Sophie, his new bride, followed his gaze. "Declan, darling, what is it?" Her eyes landed on Aurora. A flicker of confusion, then recognition, then a gathering storm of feminine indignation. What is she doing here? Aurora and Maxwell began to move, gliding through the parted sea of guests with an unhurried grace. They weren't crashing. They were gracing the event with their presence. Aurora's eyes finally found Declan's across the crowded room. She gave him a small, polite smile, a smile one might give to a vaguely familiar waiter. They reached the shell-shocked groom, the broken glass crunching under Maxwell's impeccable shoes. Ignoring the furious glare of the bride and the horrified gasp of her new mother-in-law, Aurora stopped directly in front of her ex-husband. She tilted her head, her expression one of pleasant curiosity. "Declan," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the silence of the room. "What a lovely party! You should have told me you were having one." The silence that followed Aurora's words was thick and heavy, broken only by the frantic internal calculations happening behind Declan's eyes. He looked from Aurora's impossibly serene face to Maxwell's cool, observant gaze, and then back to the shattered champagne flute at his feet. It was a perfect metaphor for his state of mind. His first instinct was aggression, the cornered animal's response. "Aurora, what the hell are you doing here? You weren't invited." His voice was louder than he intended, a raw, panicked edge to it. Aurora raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, I must have been mistaken." She feigned a look at the invitation she wasn't holding. "My apologies. We were in the neighborhood and saw the lights. We can certainly leave if we're intruding." It was a masterful stroke. She was offering him an out, a way to de-escalate, but it was an out that required him to publicly ask her to leave her who looked like a goddess, accompanied by a man who radiated influence. To do so would make him look petty and insecure. Maxwell, who hadn't said a word, simply watched Declan, his expression unreadable, but his presence immense. He was a silent checkmate on the board. Sophie the bride had no such compunctions. "I think you should," she hissed, stepping forward. Her white dress was a stark contrast to Aurora's dark silk. "This is my wedding day. You have no right to be here." Aurora finally turned her gaze to Sophie, and for the first time, a flicker of something not pity, but perhaps a detached empathy, entered her eyes. "Sophie, isn't it congratulations? He's all yours." The words were simple, but the delivery was devastating. She said it with the weary magnanimity of someone giving away a used piece of furniture. The insult was so subtle, so elegantly delivered, that Sophie was left momentarily speechless, unsure of how to even process it. Before Declan could muster a coherent response, his mother, Margaret Peterson, swooped in. Margaret had spent years perfecting her particular brand of condescending disapproval, and she had always directed the full force of it at Aurora. "Aurora, I knew you had no class, but this is a new low." Margaret spat, her voice a venomous whisper. "To show up here trying to ruin your ex-husband's happiness, it's pathetic." This was the moment Aurora had dreaded, the confrontation with the woman who had made her feel inadequate for a decade. But the old fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline clarity. "Hello, Margaret." Aurora said, her tone even and cool. "You look well." Anger is clearly a preservative. She glanced at Maxwell. "Darling, this is Margaret Peterson, Declan's mother. She was instrumental in the success of our marriage." Maxwell extended a hand. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Peterson." Maxwell Lancaster. The name landed in the charged atmosphere like a dropped anvil. Lancaster, as in Lancaster Aerospace, as in Lancaster Innovations, as in one of the 10 richest self-made men under 40 in the world. Even Margaret, in her bubble of suburban snobbery, knew that name. Her jaw, which had been set in a line of righteous fury, went slack. Her eyes widened, flicking from Maxwell's hand to his face, and then to Aurora, who was now linked with him. The equation did not compute. Margaret's hand, which had been clenched at her side, weakly rose and shook Maxwell's. Mr. Lancaster, I don't understand." "Aurora and I are together," Maxwell stated simply, leaving no room for doubt. He then turned his gaze back to Declan. "Peterson, we don't want to cause a scene. We were simply passing by. Perhaps my fiancé and I could have a celebratory drink with the happy couple and be on our way, fiancé." The word detonated in the center of the room. Aurora felt Maxwell squeeze her arm gently. They had discussed this. It was the final, unassailable piece of the narrative. She wasn't just dating a billionaire. She was marrying him. The sapphire around her neck wasn't just a gift, it was a promise. Declan stared his face, a kaleidoscope of shock, jealousy, and pure, unadulterated rage. Fiancé, the woman he had cast off as dead weight, was engaged to Maxwell Lancaster. It was a cosmic injustice. It defied the laws of the universe as he understood them, a universe that was supposed to revolve around him. The guests who had been trying their best to pretend they weren't listening were now abuzz with the revelation. The story was rewriting itself in real time. This wasn't a pathetic ex trying to spoil a wedding. This was a phoenix, risen from ashes Declan didn't even know he'd created, arriving with a dragon in tow. Trapped Declan had no choice but to play the gracious host. Of course, he choked out, forcing a smile that was more of a grimace. Let's all have a drink. He led them towards a small private study off the main hall, away from the prying eyes of the guests. The four of them, a groom in turmoil, a furious bride, a serene ex-wife, and her billionaire fiancé, entered the room. The air was thick with unspoken history and imminent conflict. Declan poured himself a large scotch and downed half of it in one gulp. He finally found his voice, a low accusatory growl directed at Aurora. "This is a game to you, isn't it? Showing up like this with him." He gestured dismissively at Maxwell. "To rub my face in it." "Your face?" Aurora asked, genuinely curious. "Declan, why would you assume my life still revolves around you? I came here tonight to close a door. You chose to have your wedding on October 12th. You must have known I'd see the invitation. Did you expect me to sit at home and cry? Is that the role you assigned me? I expected you to have some decency," he shot back. "And was it decent to tell me I was an anchor?" she replied, her voice dropping, losing its public coolness, and taking on a sharper, more personal edge. "Was it decent to dismantle my self-worth so you could walk away guilt-free? I spent years believing you, Declan. Believing I was the reason you weren't soaring." It was the truth, he insisted, his desperation making him reckless. "Look at you now. You only manage this." He waved a hand at her dress, her necklace, "because you latched onto someone richer. It's the same thing. You're just a more expensive anchor now." It was a fatal mistake. The insult was so crude, so revealing of his own transactional worldview that it hung in the air, ugly and pathetic. Before Aurora could even respond, Maxwell stepped forward slightly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Mr. Peterson Maxwell," began his voice, a quiet, lethal calm. "You seem to be under a few misapprehensions. When I met Aurora, she was already the CEO of a multi-million-dollar design firm that she built from the ground up with her own talent and grit. She had already secured the Dubai contracts that I assure you are worth more than this entire estate. I am not the source of her success. I am merely the man lucky enough to be by her side. You, on the other hand..." Maxwell paused, letting the silence stretch. He gave Declan a slow, deliberate, head-to-toe look of appraisal, the kind one gives to a faulty piece of equipment. "I've seen your file," Maxwell continued, his voice dropping even lower. "When Aurora mentioned your name, my security team did a routine background check. It's standard procedure for anyone who enters our lives. The debt from your failed crypto ventures, the margin calls you barely met by borrowing against your parents' retirement fund. Your ascent in finance seems to have been more of a free fall." Declan's face went from pale to ashen. He looked like he'd been physically struck. "You have no right. Don't talk to me about rights." Maxwell cut him off, the steel in his voice, now unmistakable. You left a woman like Aurora, and you tried to break her spirit on the way out. Now you stand here in a suit, probably paid for by your father-in-law, in a venue paid for by your father-in-law, about to accept a job you didn't earn from your father-in-law, and you have the audacity to call her an anchor. Every word was a perfectly aimed shot. Sophie, who had been watching with righteous anger, now had a flicker of confusion and doubt in her eyes. She looked at Declan, then at Maxwell, then back at Declan, searching his face for a denial. She found none. She only saw the panicked, guilty sweat beading on his forehead. The first crack in the facade of her perfect king had appeared, and it was starting to spread. The silence in the study was no longer just tense. It was suffocating. Maxwell's words hung in the air, each one a damning indictment that stripped away Declan's carefully constructed persona. Declan stood exposed not as a titan of industry, but as a desperate man in a rented suit. Sophie was the first to break the silence. Her voice was small, uncertain, a stark contrast to her earlier fury. "Declan, what is he talking about? What debt?" Declan rounded on her, his panic curdling into desperate anger. "He's lying. Sophie, can't you see what this is? She's brought him here to ruin our day, to plant these lies." But his denial was weak, his eyes shifty. He couldn't meet her gaze. He couldn't meet anyone's. Aurora watched him, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. The anger she had held on to for so long was dissolving, replaced by a cold, clear pity. He wasn't the formidable man who had crushed her spirit. He was just a boy in a man's body, terrified of being found out. "It's not a lie, is it, Declan?" she said softly. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "I remember the late nights, the frantic phone calls you tried to hide. I remember you selling off the stocks my grandfather left me, telling me it was for a guaranteed investment. I just never put it all together. I believed you when you said it was my fault, that my lack of vision was stressing you out." She took a step closer, her voice remaining low and steady, a stark contrast to his unraveling composure. "The story you told me about me being an anchor, that was never the truth. The truth is your ship was already sinking, wasn't it? You weren't cutting an anchor. You were jumping onto the nearest lifeboat." She glanced at Sophie, whose hand had flown to her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. The lifeboat had a name. "No," Declan snarled, cornered. He turned back to Aurora, his face contorted with a venomous resentment. "You want to talk about the truth? You were never satisfied. You were always pushing your little design business, your little projects. You should have been supporting me, my vision. If you had just been the wife I needed, none of this would have happened." It was his last, desperate gambit, blame the victim. But the words, once so powerful, were now hollow and pathetic. Maxwell let out a short, mirthless laugh. "The wife you needed? You mean the financier you didn't have? Mrs. Peterson," he said, turning his attention briefly to Margaret, who was frozen by the door, her face a mask of disbelief. "You must be proud." But the final devastating blow didn't come from Maxwell or Aurora. It came from Sophie. Her initial shock had hardened into a cold, terrifying clarity. The little inconsistencies she had overlooked, the vague answers Declan gave about his business, his eagerness to have her father handle all their finances, it all clicked into place. The man she had just married wasn't a king building an empire. He was a refugee seeking asylum from his own failures. "My father," Sophie said, her voice trembling but clear. "The vice president position at his firm. The one he offered you as a wedding gift. Was that part of the deal, Declan?" Declan's face crumpled. The fight went out of him, replaced by a desperate, pleading look. "Sophie, baby, listen to me. It wasn't like that. I love you. I fell in love with you and your father just... He saw my potential. He wanted to help. Help you?" Sophie's voice rose, laced with hysteria. "Help you by paying off your debts. Was that it was I, the bailout package? Was our marriage a business transaction?" "No, of course not," he pleaded, reaching for her. She recoiled as if his touch were toxic. "Don't lie to me. Not anymore." Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. That jet that flew over here, all those whispers from the guests, they were all looking at me, pitying me, the stupid rich girl who bought herself a husband. The raw, ugly truth of her words hung in the air. Declan had no response. His silence was a confession. This was the moment Aurora had unknowingly been waiting for. Not a moment of revenge, but of complete and utter vindication. It wasn't about her being better off. It was about the fundamental lie of their breakup being exposed. She hadn't failed him. He had failed himself, and he had used her as a scapegoat. With a quiet grace, she turned to leave. Her purpose there was finished. The door was not just closed, it was sealed, the lock turned, the key dissolved. As she reached the door, she paused beside the sobbing bride. For a moment, she saw not the snooty socialite, but another woman who had been deceived by Declan's charm. On impulse, she spoke, her voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a quiet finality. "For what it's worth," Aurora said, "I don't think you're stupid. I think you just believed him. I did too, for a very long time." Sophie looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting Aurora's. In that moment, there was a flash of understanding between two women who had occupied the same space in a man's dishonest world. Then Aurora and Maxwell were gone, stepping out of the suffocating study and back into the main hall. The string quartet had resumed, playing a brave but futile attempt to restore normalcy. But the atmosphere was irrevocably changed. The guests fell silent again as Aurora and Maxwell passed their expressions, a mixture of awe, pity, and frantic excitement. They were witnesses to a legend in the making. They didn't look back as they exited the manor. They didn't need to hear the shouting that erupted from the study. They didn't need to see Sophie rip the veil from her hair, or see Declan's mother finally comprehending the monumental fraud her son had perpetrated. As the Rolls-Royce pulled away from Blackwood Manor, Aurora looked at its reflection in the side mirror. A house of lies, ablaze with light, beginning to crumble from the inside out. She felt no joy, no schadenfreude. She just felt light. The anchor wasn't him. It had been the story he'd made her believe, and now she was free of it. The ride back to the private airfield was silent, but it was a comfortable, shared silence. Aurora leaned her head against the plush leather of the Rolls-Royce, the lights of passing cars painting fleeting patterns across Maxwell's stoic profile. The adrenaline was beginning to subside, leaving in its wake a profound and bone-deep sense of peace. The G700 was waiting for them on the tarmac, a beacon of otherworldly power in the quiet darkness of the countryside. As they ascended the stairs and the cabin door sealed shut, with a soft hiss, it felt like they were leaving the entire messy terrestrial world behind. Once airborne, the lights of the Hudson Valley spread out below them like a carpet of scattered diamonds. Aurora could just make out a cluster of lights that was Blackwood Manor, a tiny, insignificant speck in the vast darkness. "Are you okay?" Maxwell asked, his hand covering hers. "I am," she said, and she was surprised by the depth of her own sincerity. "I'm better than okay." For 2 years, I've been carrying this weight, this narrative that I was less than, that I wasn't enough. I thought seeing him again would hurt. I thought seeing him happy would break me. She looked out the window at the shrinking lights below. But he wasn't happy, he was terrified. And I wasn't broken. I was free. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but they were not tears of sadness. Thank you, Maxwell. Not for the jet, or the dress, or the necklace. Thank you for giving me the support to go back there and find myself again. He brought her hand to his lips. I didn't give you anything you didn't already have, Aurora. I just cleared the runway. They didn't talk about Declan for the rest of the flight. They talked about the future. They planned a trip to Kyoto to see the cherry blossoms in the spring. He told her about a new philanthropic foundation he was starting for STEM education for girls, and her eyes lit up as she immediately started sketching ideas for the foundation's headquarters on a cocktail napkin. They were two people building something real, looking forward, not back. The aftermath of their visit to Blackwood Manor became the stuff of legend in New York society circles. The story pieced together from the whispers of guests and the loud, furious arguments that followed their departure spread like wildfire. The wedding, for all intents and purposes, ended the moment Aurora and Maxwell left. Sophie Miller, in a spectacular display of wrath, had called her father from the study. The conversation was reportedly short and brutally effective. The vice president position was rescinded. The financial safety net was yanked away. The marriage, not even 3 hours old, was over. Sophie left with her parents that night, leaving a humiliated Declan to face his stunned guests and his aghast mother alone in the monument to his failed ambitions. The annulment was swift and merciless. A few weeks later, Aurora saw a small piece in a business gossip column. Declan Peterson had been forced to declare bankruptcy. His parents had sold their home to cover the debts he had accrued against it. He had fallen from a height that had only ever existed in his own imagination. Aurora felt nothing. It was like reading about a stranger. One crisp December evening, she and Maxwell were walking through Central Park. Snow had just begun to fall, dusting the trees and muffling the sounds of the city. They stopped on the Bow Bridge, the same spot where Declan had proposed to her a lifetime ago. She had once avoided this place, this ghost-filled landmark of her past. But tonight, standing here with Maxwell's arm wrapped around her, the cold air on her cheeks, it was just a bridge. A beautiful bridge in a beautiful city. You know, she said, looking at the soft flakes landing on his coat. He proposed to me here. Maxwell looked at her, his expression gentle. Does it bother you to be here? She shook her head, a genuine smile on her face. No, it's just a memory, and it's not the most important one I have of this place anymore. He smiled back, pulling her closer. Good, because I was hoping to make a new one. And there, on the same spot where her old life had been promised, Maxwell Lancaster got down on one knee in the falling snow and asked Aurora Monroe to be his wife. This time, there were no illusions, no empires, no grand ambitions. There was just a man and a woman grounded in truth, love, and a respect so deep it was the foundation of their world. She said yes, of course. Her answer was as quiet and sure as the falling snow, a promise of a future that wasn't about ascending, but about being truly, deeply, and unshakably home. Aurora's story isn't just about a dramatic wedding crash. It's about rewriting your own narrative. It's about realizing that the people who try to define you are often just projecting their own failures and insecurities. She didn't need a billionaire or a private jet to be powerful, she already was. The grand entrance was just her finally choosing to see herself the way the world was about to. Her real victory wasn't Declan's downfall, but her own liberation from a story that was never truly hers. What did you think of Aurora's ultimate power move? Have you ever had a moment where you had to take back your own story from someone else? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story of strength and vindication resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their past does not define them, and make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss the next real-life drama we have in store.
The blinding flash of 1,000 cameras is a sound you get used to. For Harrison Drake, Hollywood's golden boy director, it was the rhythm of his life, a percussive beat confirming his own success. Tonight at the Cannes Film Festival, the rhythm was deafening. On his arm was Kenzie Monroe, the starlet who had replaced his wife on magazine covers and in his bed. He smirked as she preened a perfect accessory for his perfect life. But then, the rhythm stuttered. The flashes faltered. A sound far more powerful than the cameras sliced through the air, the whine of a private jet's engines. And as the cameras turned, Harrison's perfect world began to fracture. Because the woman stepping out of that jet, the one who had brought the entire red carpet to a standstill, was the plain ex-wife he had discarded like a rough draft. The air on the Côte d'Azur was thick with the scent of money salt and desperation. For Harrison Drake, it smelled like victory. His film Ashen Empire was the darling of the Cannes Film Festival, and he, its visionary director, was the man of the hour. He adjusted the lapels of his Tom Ford tuxedo, a gesture of practiced nonchalance that he'd perfected over years of red carpets. Beside him, Kenzie Monroe, poured into a glittering, near-naked Zuhair Murad gown, played her part to perfection, her laughter tinkling like wind chimes for the microphones of Entertainment, Tonight and Variety. "Harrison, you've done it again," a reporter shouted. "From indie darling to blockbuster king. What's your secret?" Harrison's smile was a masterpiece of controlled charisma. "You just need a clear vision," he said, his hand possessively on the small of Kenzie's back. "And you need to surround yourself with people who believe in that vision, who shine as brightly as the work itself." The jab, though veiled, was for an audience of one, a ghost, who haunted his triumph, his ex-wife, Isabella Rossi. Just 18 months ago, Isabella had been the one standing just out of frame, holding his coat, making sure his publicist had his schedule. Her own, simple, elegant, but ultimately forgettable dress. A stark contrast to the glitz around her. Isabella, with her quiet intelligence, her steady gaze and her complete lack of interest in the performative circus of Hollywood. She had been his rock for 12 years, the silent partner in his ascent. She'd managed their finances with a shrewdness that baffled him, turning his early meager paychecks into a formidable portfolio. She'd read every draft of his scripts, her notes always delivered gently on paper, never in front of others, sharpening his stories and deepening his characters in ways he'd never admit. He remembered their last fight in their sprawling Pacific Palisades home, the glass walls overlooking an indifferent ocean. He had just wrapped Ashen Empire, the film he knew would launch him into the stratosphere. Kenzie had been his lead actress, and their on-set affair was the worst-kept secret in the industry. "I can't do this anymore, Izzy." He'd said the nickname, a cruel relic of a love that had long since curdled. "We're just on different paths." Isabella had looked at him, her face pale, her dark hair pulled back in its usual simple knot. She wore a plain grey cashmere sweater and jeans. She was the picture of comfort, of home, of everything he now found suffocating. "What path is that?" "Harrison, the one that ends with you believing your own publicity. It's about image," he'd shot back, his voice echoing in the minimalist space she had so carefully curated. "Look at you. You're brilliant. I know, but you're not. Aspirational. When I step onto a red carpet, I need a partner, not a manager. Kenzie, she understands the brand." The word had hung in the air between them, brand. That's what he had become. That's what their life was supposed to be. And she was off-brand. The divorce was swift and brutal. His high-powered lawyer, Harriet Walsh, painted Isabella as an unsupportive, frumpy homebody, holding back her dynamic husband. The press, fed a steady diet of curated leaks from Harrison's team, ran with it. They ran photos of Isabella taking out the recycling bins, her face makeup-free, juxtaposed with glamorous shots of Harrison and Kenzie at Chateau Marmont. The headlines were merciless Drake's drab wife, dumped for dazzling starlet, the woman who couldn't keep Hollywood's hottest director. Isabella never fought back. She took the settlement, a fraction of what she was owed, but enough to disappear, and she did just that. She vanished from the Los Angeles scene, leaving Harrison to build his new life on the ashes of their old one. He told himself it was for the best. He was free. He was with a woman who matched his ambition, whose beauty was a currency he could spend. Here on the Cannes red carpet, with the flashbulbs reflecting in Kenzie's diamond earrings and the world at his feet, he should have felt nothing but elation. But a strange unease prickled at him. He kept scanning the crowd, half expecting to see Isabella's disappointed face in the sea of adoring ones. He hadn't heard from her or about her in over a year. It was as if she had ceased to exist. "Darling, you're drifting," Kenzie purred, her fingers digging into his arm. "Smile for Vogue, France." He snapped back to the present, the wide, practiced smile returning to his lips. He was Harrison Drake. He was on top of the world. Ghosts couldn't touch him here. It was then that the sound began, a low, powerful hum that grew into the unmistakable whine of jet turbines spooling down. It was coming from the nearby Mandelieu airfield, reserved for the wealthiest festival attendees. It was an audacious sound, an acoustic interruption of the carefully orchestrated red carpet ballet. Heads began to turn. The long lenses of the paparazzi, like a flock of metallic birds, swiveled away from him and Kenzie. "What is that?" Kenzie asked, annoyed at the shift in focus. Harrison squinted toward the airfield, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Someone with more money than manners, probably. Some tech billionaire trying to make an entrance. A sleek silver Gulfstream G700. A plane that screamed new money and absolute power, taxied into view, its navigation lights blinking defiantly. It stopped, and a staircase gleaming under the festival lights descended to the tarmac. For a moment, nothing happened. The entire red carpet held its breath. The reporters, the photographers, even the stars, all stared captivated by the unscheduled drama. Harrison felt a strange, cold premonition crawl up his spine. The door of the jet opened. The silence that fell over the photographer's pit was absolute. It was a void of clicks and shouts, a vacuum of stunned awe. The figure that appeared at the top of the jet's stairs was silhouetted at first, a slender shape against the bright interior of the cabin. Then she took a step forward into the light. It was a woman, but that was too simple a word. She was an apparition. She wore a gown of deep emerald green Schiaparelli silk that seemed to drink the light. It wasn't a dress designed for ingenues. It was a statement of power. Architectural, with a single sculptural shoulder, it flowed not around her body, but with it, as if it were a second skin. Her dark hair, once perpetually in a sensible knot, was now cut in a sharp, elegant bob that grazed her jawline, gleaming like polished obsidian. Around her neck was a single, breathtaking piece of jewelry, a Bulgari Serpenti necklace, its diamond and emerald scales catching the light and throwing it back with contemptuous fire. But it wasn't the clothes or the jewels that held the world captive. It was her face. The face Harrison knew better than his own. It was Isabella, yet it was not. The uncertainty was gone from her eyes. The quiet deference had been replaced by a placid, unshakable confidence. Her skin, once pale now, had a sun-kissed glow, as if she'd spent the last year sailing seas he could only dream of. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't have to. She simply paused at the top of the stairs, her gaze sweeping over the scene below with a cool, analytical calm. Behind her, a man stepped out of the jet. He was tall, with silvering hair at his temples and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. He wore a custom Brioni suit with the ease of a man who has never had to check a price tag in his life. The reporters in the pit began to whisper their voices, a low, frantic hum. The name passed from lip to lip like a shockwave. Nikolai Volkov. The name was a legend in the worlds of finance, tech, and geopolitics. A reclusive, almost mythical figure, Volkov was the founder of Volkov Global, a private equity firm so powerful it could alter the economies of small nations. He was Russian by birth, a citizen of the world, by choice, with homes in Geneva, London, and on a private island in the Grenadines. He never gave interviews. He never walked red carpets. His photograph was so rarely seen that many believed he was a fiction, a corporate ghost. And he was standing behind Isabella Rossi, his hand resting lightly on her back, a gesture not of possession, but of quiet solidarity. On the red carpet, Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, panicked drum. It was like watching a film in a language he didn't understand. This couldn't be Isabella. His Isabella. The woman who wore J. Crew and thought a splurge was a first edition Virginia Woolf novel. The woman who got nervous speaking to more than 3 people at once. Who is that? Kenzie hissed, her voice tight with a mixture of confusion and raw, undisguised jealousy. She didn't recognize Isabella. To her, Isabella was just a blurry paparazzi photo, a drab footnote. But Harrison recognized her. He was seeing the woman he had created in his mind, the ghost he had tried to exorcise, made flesh and blood, and draped in couture. Volkov said something to Isabella, his voice too low to be heard. She gave a slight nod, and then, with a grace he had never seen in her, she descended the stairs. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight ahead, her posture perfect, her every movement deliberate and serene. Volkov followed a step behind his presence, a shield of immense power. As they reached the tarmac, a black Mercedes Maybach, which had been waiting discreetly, pulled forward. A security guard, clearly part of Volkov's private detail, opened the door, and then for the first time Isabella turned her head. Her eyes, cool and distant, scanned the red carpet. They passed over the clamoring press, over the gawking celebrities, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping second, they met Harrison's. There was no anger in her gaze, no pain, no love or longing. There was nothing. It was the look one gives to a stranger in a crowd, a momentary, meaningless connection before moving on. In that single empty glance, Harrison Drake was utterly and completely dismissed. It was a public execution, far more brutal than any tabloid headline he had orchestrated against her. She got into the Cums. Volkov followed. The door closed with a silent, definitive thud. The spell was broken. The photographers erupted. They abandoned Harrison and Kenzie, completely rushing towards the security barricades, screaming questions at the black car as it pulled away. Mr. Volkov. Who is she, Isabella? A word for the press. Is Volkov Global moving into film? Harrison stood frozen, the Tom Ford tuxedo suddenly feeling like a cheap costume. Kenzie was tugging at his arm, her voice a shrill whine in his ear. Harrison, what is going on? People are leaving. Do something. But he couldn't move. He just stared at the taillights of the Maybach as it disappeared down the Croisette. The ghost he thought he'd banished had returned. And she hadn't just come back to haunt him. She'd come back to take his crown. The story of Isabella's transformation wasn't one of a fairy godmother or a winning lottery ticket. It was a story of quiet deconstruction, a meticulous rebuilding, a process that began in the tear-soaked wreckage of her marriage. After the divorce, Isabella didn't flee to an ashram or a wellness retreat. She went to Geneva, Switzerland. The choice was deliberate. It was the antithesis of Los Angeles' old, discreet and serious. It was a city of bankers, diplomats and watchmakers, people who understood the value of precision and silence. She chose it because it was a place where her particular brand of intelligence, the kind Harrison had dismissed as merely managerial, was a valued commodity. With the settlement money, she rented a modest but elegant apartment overlooking the lake and enrolled in a master's program at the University of Geneva, not in business, but in art history and authentication. It was a passion she had buried for years. Her grandfather, an Italian immigrant, had been a small-time art dealer with an incredible eye, and he had taught her everything he knew. She had a gift for seeing the story behind the canvas, for recognizing the subtle brushstroke of a master or the telltale flaw of a forgery. It was a world of facts, history, and tangible value, a welcome antidote to the smoke and mirrors of Hollywood. For 6 months, she immersed herself in study. She lost the weight of her grief and the pallor of a life lived in someone else's shadow. She spent her weekends exploring small galleries and auction houses, not buying but observing. She was retraining her eye, honing the gift her grandfather had given her. She cut her hair, bought clothes that suited her own minimalist aesthetic. Acris the Ro Loro Piana, not for a man's approval, but for the simple pleasure of inhabiting her own skin. She was becoming herself piece by piece. She met Nikolai Volkov, not at a glamorous party, but at a dusty Christie's preview for an estate auction of old master drawings. It was a low-profile event, attended only by serious collectors. Isabella was there for a class assignment, studying a series of what were believed to be minor works by a student of Rembrandt. Volkov was there because he owned the auction house's parent company. He rarely attended such events, but his top art advisor was ill, and he had a peculiar interest in the Rembrandt school. He stood at the back of the room observing the observers, his mind a silent ledger of human behavior. He noticed Isabella immediately. She wasn't cooing over the marquee pieces. She was standing in front of a small, forgotten drawing of a sleeping dog, catalogued as follower of Rembrandt. She had a small magnifying glass and was studying the cross-hatching on the paper with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. She spent nearly 20 minutes in front of the small, unfashionable piece. Intrigued, Volkov approached. "You see something the experts have missed," he stated, his voice a low rumble with a faint Russian accent. It was not a question. Isabella looked up, startled. She saw a man whose eyes held the unnerving stillness of a predator. She wasn't intimidated. She was tired of being intimidated. "I see an inconsistency," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The catalogue says it's Dutch paper from the 1650s, but the watermark, you can barely see it against the light. It's a fleur-de-lis. That's French paper, likely from the 1670s. And the ink," she leaned in again, "the iron gall ink has faded in a way that suggests a different acidity, a different recipe than the one Rembrandt's studio used." Volkov was silent for a long moment, his gaze sharp. "So, it is a forgery?" "No," Isabella corrected him gently. "It's not trying to be a Rembrandt. I think it's an early Fragonard. He was known to have obsessively copied the Dutch masters as a young man in the 1750s, a full century later. The lines are too soft, too sentimental for Rembrandt's circle. It's worth very little as a follower of Rembrandt, but as a previously unknown study by a young Jean-Honoré Fragonard, it's priceless." Volkov stared at her, and for the first time in years, he was genuinely surprised. His team of world-renowned experts had missed it completely. This quiet, unassuming woman had in 20 minutes rewritten the history of a forgotten sketch. "What is your name?" he asked. "Isabella Rossi. You are not a collector." "Ms. Rossi. No, I'm a student." He smiled a rare, thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I believe your studies are complete. My jet leaves for Monaco in an hour. I want you to come and look at my private collection. I will pay you a consulting fee that will make your university tuition look like a rounding error." It was a test, a power play. A year ago, Isabella would have demurred, apologized, and fled. But the woman standing in the gallery was not the same person who had packed her bags in Los Angeles. She had spent months rediscovering her own worth, a value not tied to a man's career or a glamorous lifestyle. She met his gaze without flinching. "I can't leave tonight, Mr. Volkov. I have a seminar tomorrow morning on Venetian glassmaking. I'll be available next week." A flicker of respect entered Volkov's eyes. He nodded. "My office will be in touch, Ms. Rossi." That was the beginning. It was not a romance. It was a professional relationship of the highest order. Nikolai Volkov had not become a billionaire by surrounding himself with sycophants. He collected assets, and he had just identified the most valuable kind, a brilliant, uncorrupted human mind. Isabella became his secret weapon. She vetted his art acquisitions, her sharp eye saving him millions and making him tens of millions more. She traveled with him on his jet, not as a companion, but as a senior advisor. From art, her role expanded. He saw how she analyzed paintings and realized she could apply the same logic, finding hidden value, spotting fakes, understanding historical context to corporate balance sheets and investment opportunities. She had a mind for systems and a gut for authenticity. He began to include her in meetings for Volkov Global, initially as a silent observer. Soon, the hardened executives and bankers found themselves listening when the quiet woman at the end of the table offered a perspective they had completely missed. The personal relationship grew slowly, organically, out of shared intellectual respect. He was fascinated by her quiet strength and her utter lack of avarice. She was the only person in his orbit who didn't want anything from him. She was fascinated by his vast, complex world and the mind that commanded it. He taught her about power, and she in turn began to reteach him something about passion. The trip to Cannes was his idea. He had followed the media frenzy around Ashen Empire. He had read the cruel articles about Isabella, and for the first time in a long time, Nikolai Volkov felt something akin to anger. It was inefficient. It was a waste. They had taken a diamond and called it a stone. "He is being celebrated for his vision," Nikolai had said to her a week before the festival in his penthouse overlooking Monaco. "But you were the architect of his ascent. You managed the money that allowed him to make his first film. You sharpened the scripts that got him noticed. He built his empire on your foundation and then discarded you. This is an imbalance in the market. It needs to be corrected." "I don't want revenge," Nikolai Isabella had said, looking out at the super yachts in the harbour. "This is not revenge, Isabella," he replied, his voice soft. "Revenge is a messy, emotional affair. This is a market correction. We are not going there for him. We are going so the world can see the asset they undervalued. We are going to announce the launch of our new media investment division, Volkov Arts and Media. And you," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle, "will be its head." So, she had agreed. The Schiaparelli gown, the Bulgari necklace, they weren't a costume. They were a uniform, the uniform of a woman who had finally stepped into her own power, a power that had been there all along, just waiting to be authenticated. The party was held on the Odyssey, a 150-meter super yacht chartered by a Saudi prince for the festival's elite. It was the kind of event where deals worth more than the GDP of some countries were sealed with a handshake and a glass of vintage Dom Perignon. Harrison Drake was there not as a conqueror, but as a ghost. The story of Isabella's arrival had spread through Cannes like wildfire. It wasn't just gossip, it was financial news. Nikolai Volkov, the titan of industry, had not only appeared in public, but had unveiled a new partner and a new venture. The focus had shifted entirely from Harrison's film to the mysterious woman on the billionaire's arm. Ashen Empire was suddenly old news. Harrison nursed a scotch, the ice rattling against the glass in his trembling hand. He had been trying to get his publicist on the phone for hours, but she was busy doing damage control. Kenzie had become sullen and accusatory, her earlier adoration curdling into resentment. "You told me she was nobody," she'd hissed at him in their suite at the Hotel Martinez. A pathetic little mouse. She's with Nikolai Volkov. Do you know who that is? He could buy our entire studio with the change in his sofa. Now, at the party, Kenzie was pointedly ignoring him, laughing too loudly with a rival actor. Harrison felt a cold, unfamiliar panic. His entire identity was built on being the center of attention, the man in control. Now, he was a spectacle of a different kind, the man who had been upstaged by the woman he threw away. He had to talk to her. He had to understand. He had to regain some semblance of control. He saw her across the deck. She was speaking with Luc Besson, the famed French director and the CEO of Sony Pictures Classics. Nikolai Volkov stood nearby, a silent, imposing guardian, speaking with the French Minister of Culture. Isabella wasn't being paraded. She was holding court. She held a flute of champagne, but wasn't drinking it. Her posture was relaxed, her expression engaged and intelligent as she discussed the distribution challenges for independent European cinema. Harrison straightened his jacket, pasted on a facsimile of his charming smile, and moved toward her. This was his world. He knew how to navigate these waters. Well, well, he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced. Look who it is. Isabella Rossi, taking Cannes by storm. I have to say, Izzy, I'm impressed. Quite the upgrade. Luc Besson and the Sony exec looked at him, then at Isabella, their expressions carefully neutral. The air crackled with tension. Isabella turned to him slowly. Her face betrayed no emotion. She was not the flustered, emotional woman he could so easily manipulate. This was a stranger. Harrison, she said, her voice even and cool. It was the first time she had spoken to him in 18 months. I heard your film was well received. Congratulations. It was a polite, professional courtesy, delivered with the same warmth one might offer a bank teller. The dismissal was profound. Don't Harrison me, Izzy. We were married for 12 years, he said, trying to force an intimacy that was no longer there. What is all this? Who is this guy? Did you hit the jackpot? The Sony executive cleared his throat. If you'll excuse us, Isabella, we can continue this tomorrow. He and Besson made a hasty retreat, sensing the impending explosion. Isabella didn't look away from Harrison. The jackpot, as you call it, was realizing my own value. Something you were never able to calculate. Oh, please, he scoffed, his charm giving way to his raw, wounded ego. Don't give me some self-help garbage. You fell into the arms of a billionaire. It's the oldest story in the book. Before Isabella could respond, a shadow fell over them. Nikolai Volkov had finished his conversation and moved to her side. He was taller than Harrison, and his stillness seemed to suck the air out of the space around them. Mr. Drake, Volkov said. His English was perfect, clinical. My partner and I were having a professional discussion. I would appreciate it if you did not interrupt. He emphasized the word partner, making it clear it was not a romantic euphemism, but a statement of fact. Harrison, emboldened by scotch and desperation, turned on him. You stay out of this. This is between me and my ex-wife. Volkov's eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed slightly. Ms. Rossi is my colleague, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low temperature. And you are embarrassing yourself. You are behaving like a jilted lover, when in fact you were the one who terminated the contract. It is illogical. Just then, Kenzie sashayed over her eyes, flashing with fury. She had seen Harrison talking to Isabella and could not stand it. There you are, she snapped at Harrison, before turning her venom on Isabella. So you're the little mouse he was married to. I have to hand it to you. Bagging a Russian oligarch. That's quite the comeback. I guess all those years learning to balance his checkbook paid off. Isabella looked at Kenzie, not with anger, but with something that looked almost like pity. It was the look of a woman observing a caricature of her former self, a woman whose entire worth was tied to the man she was with. You've misunderstood. Ms. Monroe, Isabella said, her voice calm and precise. I don't balance Mr. Volkov's checkbook. I manage a multi-billion-dollar investment portfolio for his firm. You are in Harrison's film. I, on the other hand, am in a position to finance films. There is a difference. The words landed like slaps. Kenzie's jaw dropped, her painted-on smile faltering. She looked from Isabella's serene face to Harrison's stunned one. Harrison felt the deck of the yacht sway beneath him. She wasn't his accessory. She wasn't his ghost. She was a power player. He had come here seeking control and had found only humiliation. He looked at Isabella, at the woman he had called drab and unaspirational, and for the first time he saw not what he had lost, but what he had failed to see. He had owned a masterpiece and in his ignorance had kept it in the attic. This isn't over. He snarled, a pathetic threat from a king who had just been dethroned. Isabella gave a small, sad shake of her head. "You're right, Harrison," she said, and her voice was no longer cold, but tinged with a genuine final sorrow. "It isn't, but not in the way you think." She turned, and with Nikolai Volkov at her side, walked away, leaving Harrison and Kenzie alone in the center of the deck, the object of 100 pitying, scornful stares. The poisoned chalice of fame had been passed, and Harrison was finally forced to drink. The seed of the great twist in Harrison Drake's life wasn't planted on a yacht in Cannes, but years earlier in a dusty attic in suburban New Jersey. When Isabella's grandfather, Lorenzo Rossi, passed away, he left her his modest house. While clearing it out before the sale, long before Harrison had made his first feature film, Isabella found a trunk. Inside, amongst old photographs and service medals from the Italian army, was a stack of yellowed, brittle paper tied with a faded red ribbon. It was a manuscript. Written in Italian, it was a historical epic, a deeply researched and passionately written story about the Sforza family and their clandestine influence over the art and politics of Renaissance Milan. It was titled Il Dominio dell'Ombra, the Dominion of the Shadow. Her grandfather, a man she knew only as a quiet art dealer, had secretly been a writer, a historian. The story was magnificent, full of intrigue, betrayal, and the secret power that art wielded over society. It was rough, unfinished, but the vision was staggering. She was young then and deeply in love with Harrison, a struggling film student with grand ambitions. In a moment of unguarded intimacy, she shared her discovery with him. She translated chapters for him aloud, her voice filled with pride for the grandfather she was only now getting to know. Harrison had been electrified. "This is it, Izzy. This is a real story," he'd exclaimed. "This is better than anything they're teaching us in film school." He convinced her to let him use it to adapt it. "It's your grandfather's legacy," he'd argued. "We can bring it to life. It'll be our project." Trusting him completely, she agreed. He promised her a story-by credit, a promise he said would be set in stone once a studio picked it up. Harrison worked on the script for 2 years. Isabella helped researching period details, clarifying translations, and ensuring the complex web of family allegiances was coherent. He called the script Ashen Empire. He stripped away the nuance, simplified the characters, and sexed up the plot. He kept the core story, the secret history, the artistic intrigue, but he buried its soul under a mountain of Hollywood convention. When he finally got an agent, the agent gave him blunt advice. "The story is fantastic, but you can't have 2 unknown names on the script." A story-by credit for a dead Italian immigrant nobody's heard of, it's a non-starter. It needs to be your vision, solely. Written and directed by Harrison Drake. It's cleaner, more powerful. Harrison, desperate for his break, agreed. He told Isabella it was a temporary measure, a strategic move to get the film made. "Once I have some power, I'll fix it." I swear, he'd promised. She believed him, but success changed him. The lie became the foundation of his career. Ashen Empire became his calling card, the proof of his genius. The original manuscript was forgotten, a dirty little secret buried under a mountain of awards and accolades. When he divorced Isabella, he assumed the secret was buried with their marriage. He had the only copy of the translation, and the original Italian manuscript he believed was lost when her grandfather's house was sold. He was wrong. Isabella, sentimental and meticulous, had kept the original. It was stored in a climate-controlled vault in Geneva, along with her grandfather's letters and journals, which detailed his writing process. It was her last link to him, a piece of her history. She had never intended to use it. To do so would have been to admit the entirety of her marriage was built on a liar theft. The pain was too great. But standing on that yacht, watching the man who had stolen her family's legacy try to publicly diminish her, something shifted. It was no longer about her pain. It was about her grandfather's honor. It was about reclaiming a story that had been stolen and corrupted. The morning after the party, Isabella sat with Nikolai Volkov in the serene, sun-drenched lounge of their villa in the hills above Cannes. The original ribbon-tied manuscript sat on the glass table between them. "He didn't just leave me," Isabella said, her voice quiet but firm. "He erased my family. He built his kingdom on my grandfather's bones." Nikolai listened, his face impassive. When she finished, he picked up a single page of the delicate manuscript, handling it with the care of a surgeon. He couldn't read the Italian, but he could see the history in it. "This is not a matter for the tabloids," he said finally. "A public accusation becomes a he said, she said, messy, imprecise. His lawyers would bury you in litigation. There is a more elegant solution." He looked from the manuscript to her. "His power comes from the perception of his genius. If we take that, he has nothing left. His brand, as he calls it, evaporates." "What are you suggesting?" Isabella asked. "We don't expose the theft of Ashen Empire," Nikolai said, a glint in his eye. "Not yet. That is our trump card. First, we establish a new narrative. We use the resources of Volkov Arts and Media to acquire the film rights to another great lost European story. We hire a revered, unimpeachable director. And you, Isabella Rossi, will be the producer. You will champion it. You will speak about the importance of preserving authentic stories, of honoring the original creator's vision. You will become the face of artistic integrity." He leaned forward slightly. "We will build you up as the anti-Harrison Drake, the restorer of legacies, not the thief of them. Then once your reputation is unassailable and at a moment of our choosing, this manuscript will surface. Not through an angry accusation, but through a calm academic press conference. A literary discovery, the original source material for an acclaimed film. The evidence will be presented, the manuscript, the letters, the carbon dating of the paper. It won't be a scandal. It will be a historical correction. He won't be a villain. He'll be a footnote, a fraud." Isabella looked at her grandfather's handwriting. She saw the story not as a weapon of revenge, but as an instrument of justice. It was a path that didn't require her to scream, but to build. It was a strategy of such cold, calculated brilliance that it took her breath away. It was the Volkov way. "And Harrison?" she asked. "Mr. Drake will be left with a choice," Nikolai said, placing the page gently back on the stack. "He can fade into obscurity, or he can fight and be publicly dismantled by a mountain of irrefutable evidence. Either way, his dominion of shadow comes to an end." Isabella closed her eyes, took a deep breath of the French air, and made her decision. She was no longer a ghost. She was the hand of fate. 2 days later, the most anticipated press conference of the Cannes Film Festival took place not in a crowded theatre, but in the opulent ballroom of the Carlton Hotel. The press had been summoned by Volkov Global for a major announcement. Harrison Drake, who was supposed to be celebrating the lucrative distribution deal for Ashen Empire, found his own press event cancelled as every major journalist in town flocked to the Carlton. He watched it on a television in his hotel suite alone. Kenzie had already left, flying back to LA with a flimsy excuse about a costume fitting her agent, having correctly identified Harrison as sinking stock. The stage was simple, a long table with 3 chairs. In the center sat Isabella Rossi, poised and elegant in a navy blue Chanel suit. To her left sat Nikolai Volkov, a silent, formidable presence. To her right sat Pedro Almodovar, the legendary Spanish director, a man whose artistic integrity was beyond question. Isabella was the one who spoke. Her voice, amplified by the microphones, was calm, confident, and clear. Good morning. We are here today to announce the first official project of Volkov Arts and Media, she began. She didn't mention Harrison. She didn't mention Ashen Empire. She spoke of a new vision for film, one dedicated to finding and funding unique, authentic voices, particularly those whose stories had been lost to history. Our mission, she said, her eyes sweeping across the room, is to be custodians of story, to ensure that the legacy of great creators is honored, not diluted. She then announced their first project, an adaptation of a recently rediscovered manuscript by Mercè Rodoreda, a Catalan novelist whose work was suppressed under the Franco regime. It was a story of immense cultural and historical significance. Pedro Almodovar then spoke passionately about the project, calling Isabella a visionary producer with the soul of a historian and praising Volkov Arts and Media for its commitment to art over crass commercialism. The message was unmistakable. It was a perfectly executed maneuver that established Isabella as a serious, powerful force in the industry, a champion of the very artistic purity Harrison had been accused of abandoning. The press was ecstatic. This was a real story. The birth of a new studio, a new philosophy. Harrison felt the walls of the suite closing in. He was yesterday's news, a hollow brand. He called his agent, his lawyer. The advice was unanimous. Stay quiet. Do nothing. Wait for it to blow over, but it didn't blow over. It was only the beginning. Over the next few months, Isabella became a celebrated figure in the world of international film. She was profiled in the New York Times magazine and the Financial Times, not as an ex-wife, but as a brilliant executive reshaping the industry. Volkov Arts and Media became the most exciting new player in the market. Harrison's world, meanwhile, was crumbling. The buzz around Ashen Empire had died, eclipsed by Isabella's story. Whispers began to circulate. People who had known them both in the early days started talking. Small inconsistencies in Harrison's story of how he came up with the idea for the film began to surface. No one made a direct accusation, but the narrative was shifting. His genius was no longer seen as a given. It was now a question mark. The final move came 6 months after Cannes. It wasn't a press conference, but an academic symposium hosted by Columbia University's Department of Italian Studies, funded by a grant from the Volkov Foundation. The keynote address, delivered by a renowned textual scholar, was titled Il dominio dell'ombra, a lost masterpiece, and its modern adaptation. The presentation was a clinical, brutal dismantling of Harrison Drake's entire career. Using spectroscopic analysis of the ink and paper, carbon dating, and comparisons of her grandfather's known letters to the manuscript's handwriting, the scholar proved unequivocally that the manuscript was an authentic document written by Lorenzo Rossi between 1977 and 1980. Then he presented a side-by-side textual analysis of the original Italian story and the screenplay for Ashen Empire. The core plot points, character arcs, and thematic elements were identical. The theft was laid bare not as a messy accusation, but as an indisputable academic fact. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The Writers Guild of America launched an investigation. The studio that had distributed Ashen Empire issued a statement. Harrison's Oscar, which he had won for Best Original Screenplay, was now the subject of intense debate about a potential recall. His agency dropped him. The projects he had lined up vanished overnight. There was no angry confrontation, no dramatic showdown. Isabella never spoke his name in public again. She didn't have to. She had played the long game and she had won. The last time Harrison saw her was on a screen. It was the Golden Globes, a year after their Cannes encounter. She was on stage accepting the award for Best Foreign Language Film for the Rodoreda adaptation. She looked radiant in a simple, elegant Dior gown, her arm linked with Pedro Almodovar's. She thanked her team, the director, and the cast. Then she added something at the end, her voice filled with a quiet, genuine emotion. And finally, she said, looking directly into the camera, "I want to dedicate this to the storytellers whose voices were almost silenced. To my grandfather, Lorenzo Rossi, your legacy is safe now." In his cavernous, empty house in the Pacific Palisades, the house he would soon have to sell, Harrison Drake, the man who wanted to be a brand, switched off the television. He was nothing, a ghost in his own life, haunted by the memory of a woman he had called plain and the masterpiece he had been too foolish to recognize and too arrogant to honor. He had built an empire of ash, and she had simply let the wind blow it away. 2 years after the Golden Globes, the name Isabella Rossi was synonymous with prestige. Volkov Arts and Media had become a sanctuary for visionary filmmakers, a studio that measured its success not in opening weekend grosses, but in cultural impact and critical acclaim. Isabella moved through this world with a quiet authority that was more potent than any shouted command. Her partnership with Nikolai Volkov had deepened into one of mutual respect and genuine affection, a silent alliance that was the envy of all who witnessed it. She was in New York for the premiere of their latest film, a haunting drama by a young Korean director that was already being hailed as a masterpiece. After the rapturous applause and the glittering after-party at the Museum of Modern Art, she returned to her suite at the Amman, New York. A single plain white envelope had been slipped under her door. There was no stamp, no address, just her name written in a familiar cursive hand. Her heart didn't race. It just stilled. She knew the handwriting instantly. Inside was a single sheet of cheap notebook paper. Isabella, I know you have no reason to grant me this. I'm not asking for forgiveness or money or help. I am asking for 10 minutes of your time. For a conversation we should have had 15 years ago. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Cafe Reggio on McDougal Street. If you don't come, I will understand. Harrison, Cafe Reggio. The place he had taken her on their first trip to New York, back when they were just students, full of dreams and cheap coffee. He had told her it was the first cafe in America to serve cappuccino, a fact he'd learned in a film history class. A place of beginnings. Nikolai saw the letter in her hand when he entered the suite. He read her expression, not the letter. A ghost, he asked simply. An echo, she corrected him softly. She showed him the note. His face was unreadable, but his logic was sharp as ever. There is no strategic value in this meeting. He holds no assets. He has no power. He is a non-entity. Acknowledging him gives him relevance. I know, Isabella said, looking out at the lights of Central Park. This isn't for Volkov Arts and Media. This isn't even for Isabella Rossi, the producer. I think this is for Isabella Rossi, the woman who translated a manuscript in a tiny New Jersey attic. Nikolai studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. He understood. This wasn't about business. It was about closing a circle. Your security will be discreet. The next morning, Isabella walked into Cafe Reggio alone. The place was just as she remembered, dark, smelling of old wood and strong espresso, its walls cluttered with Renaissance-style paintings. He was sitting at a small table in the back, the one they had shared all those years ago. The change in him was shocking. The polished, charismatic veneer of Harrison Drake was gone, sandblasted away by failure and anonymity. He was thin, and his once perfectly styled hair was now threaded with grey and looked like it had been cut by his own hand. He wore a worn corduroy jacket and jeans. The Patek Philippe watch was gone, replaced by a simple, functional Timex. The only thing that remained were his eyes, and they were filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. When he saw her, he flinched as if her presence was too bright for the dim cafe. He stood up awkwardly. "Thank you for coming, Harrison," she said, her voice neutral. She remained standing. "Please." He gestured to the chair. 10 minutes. She sat. A waitress came over, but Isabella shook her head. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him, untouched. For a moment, he just looked at his hands. I teach screenwriting now, he said, his voice raspy. At a community college outside Cleveland. The kids are hopeful. They think they're all going to be the next big thing. He gave a small, bitter laugh. I tried to tell them that story is about truth. He finally looked at her. I didn't build my life on a lie, Isabella. My life was the lie. The house, the parties, Kenzie, all of it. It was a set, and I was playing a part. The only true thing I ever had was your grandfather's manuscript. He took a shaky breath. I'm sorry. Not for the divorce. Not for Kenzie. That was all just a symptom. I'm sorry that I stole your grandfather's story. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And I was too small a man to admit I hadn't created it. I was a thief and a coward. I know that. Isabella listened, her expression unchanged. This was the confession she once thought she needed, but she now found it hollow, sad. I have one question, he said, leaning forward, his eyes pleading. It's the one thing I don't understand. You had the manuscript. You had Volkov's power. You could have destroyed me in a day. A single call to the New York Post or TMZ. You could have made me a pariah, a monster. It would have been a huge, ugly scandal. Why didn't you... Why the symposium, the academic silent execution? It was so cold. Here it was, the final piece. The question that proved how little he had ever truly known her. Isabella looked at him, and for the first time she felt a flicker of something, not pity, but clarity. Because it was never about you, Harrison, she said. And her voice was not unkind, but it held the finality of a judge's gavel. That's what you still don't understand. A scandal would have put you at the center of the story. Your name and my name locked together in some sordid headline. I wasn't interested in that. She leaned forward slightly. My goal wasn't to make you a villain. My goal was to make you a footnote. The symposium wasn't for you. It was for my grandfather. It was about restoring his work to its rightful place in history, cleanly, with dignity and facts. It was about building something, not tearing something down. I didn't want to destroy you. I wanted to erase you from the narrative. My grandfather's narrative, and my own. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. He slumped back in his chair, the last ounce of self-deception draining from his face. He had seen it all as a battle for power between them, a zero-sum game. He finally understood that she had been playing an entirely different game all along, one he wasn't even a part of. Oh, he whispered. That was all he could say. Isabella stood up. The 10 minutes were over. The echo had faded. I hope you find some truth to teach your students. Harrison, she said. She turned and walked out of the dark cafe into the bright New York morning. She didn't look back. She felt no anger, no satisfaction, no lingering pain. She felt nothing. The space he had once occupied in her soul was now a perfect, peaceful silence. He was no longer a ghost or an echo. He was just a man in a cafe, a stranger she once knew, left alone with the ghosts of a story he had never truly understood. And so the story of Harrison Drake and Isabella Rossi serves as a powerful, real-world parable. It's a story about how the brightest lights can often cast the darkest shadows, and how true value is so often overlooked in the pursuit of fleeting glamour. Isabella's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. She didn't just get a makeover and a rich boyfriend. She rediscovered her own intellect, reclaimed her family's stolen legacy, and rebuilt her life on a foundation of integrity and strength. She proves that the most powerful comebacks aren't loud and explosive, but quiet, strategic, and definitive. What do you think? Was Isabella's move a cold, calculated act of revenge, or was it the ultimate form of justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of empowerment and transformation, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that that will leave you speechless. Thank you for watching.